Welcome everyone to our inaugural webinar series featuring the authors and editors of the Wildcat book series. I do want to just briefly mention that the entire series is sponsored by Railroad Workers United. We also have a long list of very generous co-sponsors for each of the webinar events, and you can find that on the Eventbrite page. So I'm going to turn it over to Manny Ness, who's the founder and editor of the Wildcat book series.
I'd just like to introduce Robert, who is a professor at San Jose State University, professor of political science. Thank you very much, and look forward to hearing your book series, or your book. First of all, just briefly introduce you to the Wildcat book series. It was envisioned in 2013, and it was launched in 2015, and we've put out close to 12 to 15 books so far, and we have many, many more books coming out in the next year or two. We have a very special book that is going to be the subject of discussion today, Dying for an iPhone. I just want to let everyone know that there are many other books. One of the major reasons why we began this series was to recognize that there is a workers' movement that exists and continues to, despite the fact that in many instances throughout the world, organized unions have declined dramatically. And we want to demonstrate the ways in which, through the books, the ways in which various kinds of workers' movements express themselves. We want to examine various case studies that are global, not just in the North, but also in the South, primarily, actually. And so, welcome to the series. I'd like to introduce the speakers today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Jenny Chan, who is one of the authors of the book. She's a professor of sociology at Hong Kong Polytechnic University and vice president of the Research Committee on Labor Movements, RC44, at the International Sociological Association. We have Ralph Litzinger, professor of cultural anthropology at Duke University, Ying Chen, professor of economics and faculty affiliate in the Indo-China Institute, New York, the New School, and Mark Selden, one of the authors of this book, senior research associate in the East Asia Project at Cornell University, editor, Asia Pacific Journal, and professor emeritus of sociology at State University of New York, Binghamton, sociology and history. Anyway, thank you very much, and I shall turn it over to Jenny.
Really welcome everyone from all over the world. This is an important moment that we also show global solidarity and support to these young migrant workers in China. In the following about 10 minutes, I'm going to show you the PowerPoint slides. There are some tables, graphics that might illustrate better about the ideas, right? So I'm now sharing my screen and I will maximize the slides. Okay, all right. Thank you so much again for joining us. Dying for an iPhone, the book. The book title has a double meaning. A new generation of workers is struggling to meet corporate requirements for speed and precision to producing iPhones at a time when consumers around the globe are queuing up to buy the newest models. It is an attempt for us to connect producers and consumers, as well as to reflect on the relationship between production and consumption in this digital era. 10 years ago, 18 workers attempted suicide at Foxconn facilities. 14 died, 4 survived with crippling injuries. And they were so young, all between 17 and 25 years old. All from the Chinese rural countryside. They are the migrant workers. But instead of finding out the reasons for them to take their lives, Foxconn set up all the so-called safety nets or anti-suicide nets around the dormitories and the factories. But can these safety nets help saving lives at all? By then, it's already 12 young workers who took their lives. And the concentration of the suicide cases at Foxconn points to something new and important in the context of the company's integration into the global supply chain. Studies suggest that elderly suicides represent over 40% of Chinese suicides. And the suicide cluster at Foxconn, in contrast, was carried out by young employees, the young migrant workers. So why would suicides by these young people working and living in the city spike when medical professionals found that 88% of suicides by Chinese youth occurred in the countryside? We keep asking these questions, and until a day, we refer to a worker blog and we translate here. The use of death is simply to testify that we were ever alive at all, and that while we lived, we had only despair. Is a desperate and hopeless life that they are facing. And later on, we at the hospital met with Tian Yu. Tian Yu was only 17 years old when she jumped from the 4th floor of the dormitory at Foxconn. She was born in 1993 from rural Hubei province. After 12 days of losing consciousness, she awoke, but only find that she was paralyzed from the waist down. Forever, she might be relying on the wheelchair. And now she was thrown back to where she had been in the countryside. After building some trustful relationship, she told us about the fact that she had been working in one of the business groups in Foxconn, IDPBG, Integrated Digital Product Business Group, and she had been assembling Apple's products at high speed all the time. We learned a lot more from her about the living conditions and how the work lives is like at Foxconn. And from her story, we had really conduct a collective investigation. This is the collective effort far beyond me or Mark or the author. It is a collective effort from 2010 up to the outbreak of coronavirus last year in 2019. We engaged with Foxconn workers through interviews, as well as their shared poems, songs, open letters, photos, and videos. We also supplement all these first-hand information with meetings with managers, teachers, student interns, and government officials. We have been asking the reasons of these young workers who commit suicide, but also to understand the dynamics between the global buyers as well as their suppliers. So what is Foxconn? Foxconn is history might be older than many of us right here joining the webinar today. Foxconn is a Taiwanese company. Its headquarters is called Honghai Precision Company Limited. By then, in 2010, Foxconn was the exclusive final manufacturer, not only of iPhones for Apple, but also a major contractor of a wide range of electronics products that we are now using for our webinar. Maybe our mobile phone, our laptop, our desktop computers. So in a way, we are deeply entwined and linked with Foxconn and its workers as well. Foxconn is the world's largest electronics manufacturer in total. It has more than 200 subsidiaries and branch offices in Asia, the Americas, and Europe. According to the latest company statistics, it represents 40% of the global market share in electronics manufacturing. At the peak, is more than a half of the global market share. In this global map, we can see that Foxconn's base, there have been developing and expanding base in Brazil, Mexico, and America, especially in Wisconsin, but it's seemingly like very confusing right now what Foxconn is trying to do. But in Europe, including Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, they do have quite a large scale operation there. But still, China remains the center of the profitability. So from a geopolitical perspective, since the late 1970s, Foxconn's rise coincide with the global industrial transformation that occurred as these corporate giants like IBM in the Western part as well as East Asia, they're moving their production lines abroad by outsourcing, by offshoring. Foxconn really grow in sync with China's policy as well to pursue industrial upgrading and technological advancement. At the provincial level, regional competition to secure foreign investment is really intense. And this competition had further aided Foxconn's rise. Take a look at this China map. It is as much as a Foxconn map. Foxconn runs more than 40 industrial parks across the coastal as well as interior part of China. It has been creating a 24-hour high-speed production network predicated on vertical integration and flexible coordination around the clock. Here you would have an idea about how profitable, in a way, also Foxconn or Honghai precision industry. By having a large share of revenues, it is only less than Apple or Samsung on this list. Well, you might wonder, where is Amazon? By the ranking of the Fortune Global 500 corporations, Amazon is categorized under another industry like internet services and retailing. But still, the main idea is quite clear. Even if we put Amazon right here, we will see in terms of revenues, Foxconn also have a large share, but by net profit, which is so slim, it does tell us the uneven global division of labor right here. Perhaps in this pie chart, it becomes even more clearer that Apple got the lion's share of the gross profits. Take an example of an iPhone. It is nearly 60% of the gross profits would get to the pockets of Apple. Raw materials, including aluminum or glass, it is only about 1/5. And the other suppliers, they provide more sophisticated components that is about 14%. Take a look at the Chinese workers when they assemble iPhones day and night, they got less than 2% in terms of the share. And this is just another pie chart to show you that iPhone is the major profit generator in the business of Apple by breaking down the services and the product segment. So what are the relationship right here? It is a buyer-driven supply chain. Apple is Foxconn's largest customer, and Apple and Foxconn, they are independent companies, but they are linked in product development, from engineering, design, manufacturing to sales and after sales services. Foxconn employees really race against the time at Apple's command to get the work done, regardless of the toll that compulsory overtime and speed up takes on these workers. And all these ups and downs, the sales of iPhones, it is really seasonal sensitive. And these fluctuation of orders coupled with the tight delivery requirements shift the production pressure onto the shop floor. Not only Foxconn, but also other smaller suppliers in the setting of transnational manufacturing. So Foxconn, as the largest Apple supplier, also the largest supplier of many other corporations, it needs to periodically extend working hours, adapt its workforces to the boom and bust trends of Apple product, and consequently, the company is incentivized to sign longer-term commitments to employees instead to use more short-term and informal workers. And interns is such a typical example. With continuing demand for the iPhone and other hot-selling products, Foxconn's labor needs have remained really strong, leading to aggressive practices to bolster its workforce at the lowest possible cost. The use of interns is of massive scale. In the summer of 2010, Foxconn employed 150,000 interns all over China. That makes up about 15% of its million-strong Chinese workforce. Who are these interns? They have been studying from a wide range of disciplines, from healthcare, auto repair, and some other industries, but they had been ending up in assembling our iPhones without any skills training, working overnight, day and night, excessive overtime, and 6 to 7 days a week during the peak season. Every day is just a repetition of 1 to 2 simple motions like a robot, as they tell us in the interviews. Working on the line, living in the dormitory, they have to follow the internship program. Otherwise, they will not be able to graduate on time. And as we dig deeper, I think the most important findings and evidence is the collusion of the local states. The Education Ministry and its departments will direct internship to Foxconn. So you see these kids, this is a cartoon where you will say they have no eyes to see, they have no mouth to speak, they have only ears to listen to the command and order. So these interns are the cheap labor. Foxconn doesn't enroll any of these interns into local social security, and Foxconn, with the government's support, had systematically violated the letter and the spirit of the law governing interns. Local education departments, they pitch in by identifying vocational schools that are suitable to link with the so-called internship programs, and to assure these schools' cooperation, government will give them funding to fulfill the so-called student quota. If these schools fail to meet the human resources requirements, they will not get the funding. It's not only about the compulsory internship, it is about the health and safety issue. Over the decade, we have been seeing these workers, as well as some interns, they get sick in the toxic chemical environment. One worker who is a dead man walking. So all this seems to us is pretty much tragic, and it should be prevented at the first place. The workers say, I screw the screws without a break, and each screw turns diligently, but they just can't turn around our future. This is a poem. Our screw fell to the ground in this dark night of overtime, plunging vertically, lightly clinking. It won't attract anyone's attention, just like last time on a light night does, when someone plunged to the ground. Obviously, it refers to his co-workers who jumped from the buildings and killed themselves, have all the bright blood on the ground. Is it so desperate and hopeless? Is it just like a modern form of slavery? But this is also the crisis and tragic moment that inspire the collective action and the support groups in Hong Kong, including students and NGOs and trade unions. We have been campaigning over the past decade. Fighting Foxconn is the main theme of our webinar today, and I'm now wrapping up that workers have exposed the inhumane treatment online and offline. They mobilize the media and wider support in the keynotes of globalized electronics production, particularly when sales are building up. Indeed, when workers organize by strike, they can stop or paralyze production at the significant moment of time and give pressure. And we know in response, the states trying to maintain political stability, they step in, require negotiation or talks. But these interventions typically marks the beginning of fragmentation, co-optation, or crushing of workers' power. But still, these workers are quite courageous. They lead the action, confront management, sometimes government officials or the police. They risk being charged with disturbing the social order and get fired but these acts of resistance, no matter how short-lived or small scale, it does accumulate the organizing experiences, and these workers, they will know how to articulate their demands through collective bargaining. So action had been going on, and there had been also the internet activism. In addition to organizing protests at the factory, they also do something more low-key, but they are amplifying their voices through their open letters, blog, and some other social media. So the government had stepped up a censorship and surveillance to make sure there is a media blackout. To conclude, given the economic importances of Foxconn and its durable relationship with the major clients, including Apple, engagement with workers around the world that would be strategically important to achieve long-term changes in global supply chain. And we are not just targeting Apple and Foxconn, it is indeed an industry-wide, an industry-level problem, and it has been chronic for not just 10 years, but quite some decades now. So we do want to understand deeper about the entire electronics industry and hope to find some solution. And more importantly, it is about the bottom-up organizing that might push or pressure these global companies as well as the state to respond to workers. One final note, and that is positive or encouraging news. Our book will be translated into Korean very soon. And thank you so much, really, for everyone. For all these years, without your encouragement, I never imagined that doing a book would take up a decade, but our teachers, our friends, colleagues, and most importantly, Pluto Press and Haymarket Books colleagues, our hosts, our guests, our reviewers, every one of you, your friendship and solidarity, that is really deeply appreciated. And thank you so much.
Ralph Litzinger, cultural anthropologist, professor at Duke University.
Okay, great. Thanks, Manny. Thanks, Jenny, for finally bringing this book that I've been reading bits and pieces of for really the last 5 or 6 years to the world. It's an incredibly important book, and I think in part what's probably the most important thing about it is that it is. People may not know this, but Jenny and Mark and Pun Ngai, their other co-author, have been writing a whole series of really incredible academic papers with lots of theory written for activist audience, but also mostly for academic audience. And the major impact of this book is not only that they brought together all that research and crafted a new narrative and a new story that is going to reach a wider audience. And it's an incredibly accessible narrative, and it tells incredible stories. It's both dark and sad, but it's also inspiring and opens up a space at the end to think about larger issues of labor solidarity, not only within China, but across regions in Asia and perhaps even globally. I don't want to take quite as much time as Jenny because I want to leave lots of time for Q&A. I see there's already really great questions that are coming into the chat. I just want to tell you a little bit about sort of my connection to all of this. I first got involved with the sort of Apple story when I was teaching a health and environment course at Beijing University in Beijing in 2010. This was a 3 or 4 year program that I was involved in. And in 2010, working with some activists that were not based in Hong Kong, which is really where most of the activism against Hong Kong against Foxconn has been situated. There were environmental groups in Beijing in the late 2000s, early 2010s that began to monitor environmental conditions, toxicity, heavy metal runoff into watersheds and things like this. It's mostly led by a guy named Ma Jun, who Jenny and Pun Ngai and Mark talk about in the chapter on environmentalism in the book. And what had happened there is that in Suzhou at a wind tech factory, it was discovered that iPads were still being wiped down with a chemical called N-hexane, which in the early 60s in certain concentrations had been sort of outlawed in the US. And of course, there's a very, very common story about how certain kinds of industrial products that are highly toxic make their way to the global south. And of course, Apple claimed they didn't know initially, but of course, we do know that they had very, very good data on what was going on in places like Windtech. And what was happening is that these workers were getting, by breathing in and not properly ventilated spaces, were getting a whole range of neurological defects. This was documented by some people in Beijing. They wrote a number of reports in Chinese that I then helped them translate into English. This was called sort of the Poison Apple campaign. And it's at that time, after going on television in China and talking about Apple, that I first learned about, well, then what happened immediately after this, of course, was the series, the so-called Suicide Express that happened in 2010. And this is when I found out that a whole range of colleagues like Jenny and Pun Ngai, Jack Teo and others had formed something called the Foxconn Research Group, which is talked about extensively in the book. And it started to do this sort of cross-border research, sort of going from Hong Kong into Shenzhen, into Guangzhou, and eventually into almost every sort of factory site where Foxconn was operating, to, as Jenny explained in her presentation, to try to understand not only what was motivating workers to leave the countryside to go work in these factories and put up with these conditions, but what was causing some of them to jump from buildings. What I've been interested in as sort of a kind of self-fashioned leftist critical pedagogy person involved in this stuff and in teaching this stuff. I teach a course now that I've been teaching since 2015 every year. I teach a course called Global Apple. And in many ways, this Global Apple course really tracks the book that has now become Dying for an iPhone. Let's talk a little bit about that course and the structure of it, because I think it sort of tells us also something about how important this particular book is and why it should be read. What I do in that course is two things. I start in Silicon Valley in the Bay Area. And I start with the concept of digital utopianism that emerges in the post-World War II Cold War period, where you have the development of all kinds of technologies and eventually have Xerox and HP and all these companies settle in the Silicon Valley era. What was going on alongside of this was a kind of digital utopianism that is associated with the names of people like Stuart Brand and a whole bunch of other countercultural people who actually believed that that the internet and technology was going to create a new kind of human consciousness and was going to provide people with all kinds of new tools that were going to revolutionize the world. So those of you who may be of the age to remember this was the period that produced the whole series of Whole Earth catalogs, right? If you remember those. The first one came out in 69, 70, 71, 72. From there, sort of doing a critique of that particular period of digital utopianism, we move into the early period of the history of Silicon Valley, which has been a history of just almost unthinkable environmental degradation. The person that's most associated with this, who Debbie, of course, or Jenny and other folks, of course, know, is Ted Smith, who was a lawyer in the 60s and early 70s, who started the Silicon Valley Environmental Coalition that started to point to the fact that heavy metals were entering into the water of Santa Clara Valley and were causing all kinds of cancers and other things like this. They were very, very active throughout the 70s and early into the early 80s. And then once Apple emerges, and of course, this is another thing we do in the course, is we talk about the way in which Apple markets itself. And all of you will remember the famous 1984 sort of Super Bowl ad that ran once and then became a kind of cultural sensation. This was an anti-IBM and anti-Big Brother. Again, a classic example of digital utopianism, where the idea that Apple, with its 1984 Apple computer, was going to liberate people from the corporate hegemony, the totalitarian corporate computer world represented by Big Blue or by IBM. What happens as Apple struggles financially struggles through the late 80s into the early 90s, and won't go into this. Of course, you know, Steve Jobs was let go. He went to Pixel. He came back, and when we get into the 2000s, we really have the emergence of the Apple, the global Apple as we know it today. What happened is a lot of that manufacturing of silicon chips and other kinds of electronic goods were outsourced to China. And this happened almost simultaneously with both dictates from Wall Street that told Apple, you cannot get more money unless you go to China, unless you go to places where there is cheap labor. This is the only way we will continue to fund you and give you, invest in you. This, of course, was about a decade after the opening of special economic zones, which were incredibly friendly to foreign companies to come in and invest in China. This is how we have Foxconn, of course, moving in the first instance from Taiwan into places like Guangzhou and eventually Shenzhen, and then spreading out from there. So the second half of this course, which in some ways tracks the book so beautifully, I just can't wait to. Well, I actually just did teach this in PDF form in the summer, but to actually have the book now, and I'll teach it next semester. What we then do is go into the whole history of the labor the situation in China. We focus explicitly on Foxconn. We go through the whole history of Foxconn, again, drawing on many of the articles that inform the discussion and the structure of this book that Jenny and Pun Ngai and Mark have authored through the years. We look at very in-depthly 2 weeks looking at migrant poetry as a form of resistance. So Jenny sort of gave you one example of a kind of almost a kind of a celebrity poet globally. But there's entire books and collections of migrant workers who are writing poetry about their experiences. And then the other thing we do, which is something that people always have to, when we talk about, you know, teaching students the sort of Marxist and other kinds of critical pedagogical tools to understand supply chains, you know, it's not just a question of designed in Cupertino, right? Made in China. This is the This is the thing that everybody sees on the back of their devices. We also take a deep dive into cobalt mining in places like Congo, lithium mining, sort of all the minerals, all the various kinds of deep earth mining that is in the minerals and the aluminum and all this stuff that makes something like an iPhone not only work and fire and be fast, but also aesthetically beautiful, right? This is what people love. You can't talk about Apple, and you can't talk about working conditions in factories and the toxicity and the environmental dangers without talking about how an iPhone looks or feels, because there's an incredible amount of work that goes into machine shops that make the aesthetics of the phone, right? So when I teach this class and I have students hold phones and describe, and, you know, for every student in the class, maybe one will have a Samsung. Almost everybody has an iPhone. When they hold these things, I try to get them to think about how the aesthetics, the feel, the smoothness, and the way Apple talks about the aesthetics of that object actually has these deep histories, not only in the mining industry, but also in manufacturing and in labor. Where we end the course is, again, I think we're not sure right now how much of an effect this is really happening. There is a what's called a reuse movement. There are lots of people who are organizing to break the Apple system that says that when your phone goes down, you have to take it into Apple. This, of course, plays into the planned obsolescence of every Apple device, so that right now, of course, you're going to think, I don't need my 10 anymore. The 12 just came out. I'm going to go buy that 12. And what has happened across Europe and in the US, and you can even, this is also happening in places like Shenzhen and other cities in China, India, is that there's lots of hackers who have learned how to open up. And, you know, Apple makes their phones so you can't open up. So there's people that are designing the tools, sort of stealing the tools that are used by Apple to open up their own devices, and going in there and replacing batteries and fixing the haptics, you know, with the touch thing, so you don't have to buy a new phone. This is the other thing I will say. Two more points, and then I'll wrap up. Is that what has been most striking to me over the last 5 or 6 years teaching these histories of Apple and tech industry and its environmental labor situation and its costs, is that almost all of the students who sign up for my classes come from computer science. They're computer science majors, right? And this has been a real shock to me, because I thought, oh, cultural anthropology, everybody's a leftist, you know, I'm going to get all of our, so, you know, the only people major in cultural anthropology want to change the world, you know, it's about a radical way. All 10 of them, right? All 10 majors. All the students who sign up are from computer science, right? And the reason they're from computer science, I've learned, is that they never get exposed to these histories. They've had internships in Silicon Valley, right, for the summer, but they had no idea at all about the working conditions that produce something like an iPad or an iPhone, right? They had no idea that they were working in Santa Clara Valley, that has the most Superfund sites of any place in the US, right? Because of that history of heavy metal runoff into the water. I wanted to talk a little bit, and I'm probably going to skip this. Maybe we can come back to this. Another thing I'm very interested in my own writing about Apple is in the different kinds of narratives that have emerged in the popular press to sort of explain or come to terms with Apple. the dominant narrative right now in the US, even with all this activism that we've seen coming out of the Hong Kong, East Asia context, and also out of the European context, and a little less so in the US, is what was I saying? Where was I going with this? Is that we haven't necessarily seen the kinds of solidarity across different kinds of workplaces. So of course, there were points when students, I don't know if people know this, but Students Against Sweatshops actually started at UNC and at Duke many years ago. This is where the first organizations were. We saw some solidarity between the textile industry and the electronics industry emerge through the years. And what I'm most interested in now is in these liberal narratives in the media that are now after the 2016 election and the hacking, Cambridge Analytics, and all this stuff. Now, of course, we're talking about big tech's dominance in our lives. We're talking about data mining, right? We weren't talking about these issues in the early 2010s. But now, after the 2016 election, we're talking about data mining, we're talking about privacy, and we're talking about big tech being too powerful. And this has become a kind of liberal narrative that wants to preserve the kind of sovereignty of the individual to not become a data point. But it's not necessarily a radical or a leftist narrative that takes us back to example, what is a cloud computing site? What does it mean to say that data is the new oil or a new kind of commodity, right? And how do we begin to organize around that kind of stuff? And I say this because, you know, the Foxconn research group, and as Jenny was saying, that their research into this began with the suicides. Where we've come from 2010 to 2020, this has been a massive decade. And especially in the last, certainly since the election of Trump, but even really since 2015, when we begin to see a real crackdown on labor organizing in China by the Xi Jinping regime. We're in a very different kind of moment right now with how we think about organizing, how we think about what it means to take on a company like Foxconn and Apple. And I'll just end here by telling you that the book ends, you know, right at this moment when Trump is elected in 2016, and they talk in very powerful ways about the slide that he gave us about how Foxconn is spreading around the world. The Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin story, which they sort of closed the book with. This is when Foxconn and many other companies, including Alibaba, sort of say, okay, Trump, we don't want your trade war. We're going to bring money. We're going to bring investment. We're going to build factories in places like Wisconsin. That factory today, 3 years on from the point where they end the book, right, is now a total disaster. Almost everybody has lost their jobs. The buildings have been abandoned. There's a very recent report in The Verge that sort of is recent reporting on what is happening. So I think you know what I want to leave you with is that with the election of Trump and with the shift to a new kind of authoritarianisms that we're seeing around the world, and also the ways in which the Xi Jinping regime has cracked down on Marxist study groups, on college universities, on feminist organizing, and increasingly on any kind of labor organizing, even across cities in China, let alone, you know, across the Hong Kong, Shenzhen board has become increasingly problematic. And now we have the national security law, right, that's been implemented, which I think is going to have a massive impact. Well, we don't know. It could have a huge impact on how labor organizing and forms of solidarity with worker struggles in China and in other places in the world are going to unfold in future years. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, I'd like to go on to the next speaker, Professor Ying Chen from New School University. She's a political economist, and you have the floor, Ying.
Thank you, Manny. I greatly enjoyed Jani's presentation as well as Ralph's comments on it. So I want to say I'm really delighted to join this panel and to have this opportunity to discuss this important book with everyone here. I've read works of all the authors here. I've been reading works of Marx and also Professor Pun Ngai since grad school years. And you know, Marx worked on the Chinese hukou system, the household registration system, as well as Professor Pun Ngai's work on female migrant workers have greatly influenced my own understanding of the Chinese economy. And Professor Jenny Chen's works on the Chinese workers, including her earlier works on labor contract laws and the Chinese intern mechanism, strike me really as one of the few works that combines both firsthand fieldwork research data as well as really insightful analysis. And last year, I also had the chance to attend a talk given by Jenny at the New School, from which I get to also learn about her views, her insights on the social movement prospect in China. So I think Jenny Chen's work always shows a deep empathy towards the Chinese workers who are at the bottom of the Chinese society and who are always working quietly, inconspicuously, and often ignored by the mainstream media, but who are really the people making tremendous contribution to the so-called Chinese economic miracle. And I think this book is no exception. It has placed the lives and the welfare of the Chinese workers in the center and has at the same time provided the readers with details about their struggles as migrant workers. They, on the one hand, don't feel they belong to the city, and on the other hand, cannot really afford to go back to the rural sector where they came from. But the book does more than just depicting the dilemma of those workers. It also points to the root cause of all these issues that we are seeing, we're observing here, which is the power of capital over labor. And I think the first several chapters in the book provided a lengthy discussion of the Foxconn company, both before and after the Taiwanese company penetrated the market in mainland China after its opening up. It also discussed the Apple company, showing that using data and figures to show that their soaring profits really coincide with all those tragedies that we are observing happening at the factory site. So if in the end, the book called for both the state and the corporations to work together to create a more humane place for the workers. So the question that I hope we could discuss a little more maybe in the Q&A session is regarding the political implication of it. I think one of the things the book highlights is that it will also hold the state accountable for the misery conditions of the workers, expecting it to exercise its power through making laws and announcing policies to regulate the capital. The implicit assumption here, I think, is that the state is a neutral entity and therefore it has power over capital. So I think here I really invite everyone to think about this question is whether this is whether this is the case in the context of China, and also for that matter, whether this is the case with any countries in the world at this moment in the neoliberal stage of capitalism, particularly. And I think for people who are very familiar with the history of modern China, they should be aware of the fact that the state was the first one to invite capital to exploit the workers in the first place through various policies, including decollectivization in the countryside and also the privatization of the state-owned enterprises in the urban sector, which resulted in the creation of a huge reserve army of labor. So I think when we think about this political context of such move on the part of the Chinese government, and also think about the power of capital these days, the mobility of capital today, I think the question that we need to think about is who really has more control here, who has the upper hand here. I think what we are observing here is the logic of capital. The capital is constantly seeking ways to reduce its costs, and particularly the labor costs, so that they can sustain their profits and survive the competition. And this is why we see Apple outsource its production to Foxconn. And this is why we are also seeing Apple using contracting workers, even within the United States, through companies like Apex Systems. So for a capitalist firm that is facing competition, cutting costs and particularly cutting labor costs is really the natural strategy. And Foxconn is extracting much less, as Jenny pointed out, actually Foxconn is extracting much less profit share compared to Apple. So with that, when those thin profit margin is itself facing some threat from labor militancy, what Foxconn did was shift to inner regions to reduce costs, which was also mentioned in Jenny's work. And similarly, Apple is also moving some of its production, considering moving some of its production to countries outside China to avoid those conflicts. To mention this is not to be pessimistic, and also not to defend the class or the companies by any means, but to point out instead the rationale behind all the behaviors from the state side and also from the company's side, that everything that they are doing is really conforming to the logic of capitalism, how the capital is operating in this system. And I think we should discuss more and target our critique to that system itself. Another thing I really want to mention is something that Ralph also mentioned, that one of the chapters in the book dealt with the environmental concern, and particularly the the tech pollution as a result of all the electronic products. And I think in the chapters, the alternative strategy was proposed as a green growth model. So I think this also invites some more discussion. I particularly would like to hear what the authors think about this green growth model would look like, and particularly what are we thinking about in terms of the growth? Are we thinking about, again, GDP? Because if that is still the goal of the growth, then we're basically circling back to this very model that we're being critical about, right? I think the book mentioned that one of the key problem is how the government has been really focusing on economic growth only, the kind of obsession with GDP in the past several decades. So basically, these are the two observations that I want to make here, and I would like to hear more discussion about this. But overall, I think this book is really a wonderful contribution to our understanding of the Chinese workers' struggles in the broad context of global division of labor. I think it's really a must read for for most people who are interested in labor movement and Chinese capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ying, for keeping time. And last we have Mark Selden, Senior Research Associate at Cornell University.
I want to raise a couple of other larger questions, some of which we've begun to think about, but others not. In our time remaining before we open this up to this impressive group of people asking serious questions already online. Starting with Ralph's point about digital utopianism and how we begin to rethink Apple. One of the extraordinary things that Apple has been able to do, aside from making itself the most profitable company in the world, is to be able to create an image of, well, digital utopianism, the new paradise, and to separate itself from the dark side that our book is very much about, and that Ying is pressing us to work hard at, which is capital-labor relations. Apple has been able, even in the period that ignited our own research, the period of massive youth suicides at Foxconn, to distance itself from the workplace and distance itself from the losses that the Chinese workers were experiencing, and to insist, well, that's their problem, that's Foxconn's problem. So we have a great divide. Apple is the people who make the gorgeous things, design what's in your pocket, and bring on a new world. Foxconn is responsible for the dark side. One of the things we hope that our book shows is that these are hand-in-glove relationships in which Apple has always been the senior partner, that when Apple calls, Foxconn answers. And one of the ways in which we try to do this is showing the ways in which Apple drives the overtime agenda. Come Christmas, come new models, come whatever it is that drives the market up, Apple can force Foxconn, and Foxconn can force Chinese laborers to work illegal overtime, and Foxconn is able to use the intern labor in illegal ways in China under pressure from Apple. So this is a story of a kind of well, Ralph in particular has also raised the question of the role of the state versus the role of capital, and Ying has as well. And one of the things that I think we're finding is that the genius of the Chinese state in dealing with Foxconn has been to buy Foxconn off with enormous benefits in terms of low price land, in terms of keeping, in terms of making migrant, student labor available in direct violation of Chinese law over and over again. So we have a dark picture that we want to tell, and one that places tremendous burdens on Chinese labor. I think we want to also put it in to raise an issue that we haven't mentioned at all that distinguishes China from much of the rest of the world. Ralph was pointing out that labor is facing hell as unions are disappearing in our own country, are disappearing in much of the Western world and in the third world. China is a place with very high levels of labor organization, and Foxconn brilliantly epitomizes this. This is the All China Federation of Labor. All Foxconn workers are unionized, as are many in the electronics industry. But what is the nature of labor organization in China? As we know, these are company unions. It's an almost perfect system in which the Foxconn owner's chief advisor has headed the labor union for the 20 years that it's been running. I think it's 20 years, approximately. And we have a company union par exemplaire, making it extremely difficult for workers to carry their grievances effectively to fruition. So these are some of the issues I want to raise. Let me speak finally to a question that Ying raises, the logic of capital and the logic of the state. I think that what we're seeing in Foxconn and the local state and the national state is the way that these have been working hand in hand for the most part, with occasional clashes as well. And the ability of workers to break out of this is going to require, I think, a new form of unionism, a new form of coming together that can break out of the domination of this state capital nexus that so limits a situation, even where workers, in fact, are part of a union and part of a large-scale union in China. So let me stop here.